In this session, what we're going to do is use your diet analysis plus data to do two things. Number one, you're going to evaluate that data and determine if you meet the goals. And number two, you're going to write up that evaluation in a specific format. Since I'm going to be reading about 30 of these, there's a specific format that I'd like you to use so everybody's kind of consistent in the way it's written up. But there's three documents that you're going to need to look at as you're writing up your evaluation. Number one, your 3-day average data page from your Diet Analysis Plus. You're going to download and print off your evaluation instructions, which you'll find in this lesson, lesson 3. And then a student evaluation, which is an actual write-up that a student did, that kind of shows the format that I would like you to use. So those three things you'll need to print off and make sure you have available and you read them carefully before you write your evaluation. So your 3-day average page is going to look something like this if you have the newest version of Diet Analysis Plus. If you don't, it is not going to look like this. So it'll be similar and you'll just have to figure out. But the main thing is here you're going to have two columns. One's the DRI column, which is your goals, and the second is going to be your actual intake column, which is the data from your 3-day actual intake. So we'll be going back and forth and using this information plus other information in your 3-day average pages. There should be several pages that you'll print off that we'll be using. Now the first set of data evaluations you'll do is based on the carbohydrates. And what you're going to be doing is looking at those intake versus goals information from your 3-day average, and you're going to be looking at your carbohydrate intake and determining if it meets the 58% goal, with 48% being complex natural and 10% being refined. If you look at the there's just below this 3-day average page with the two columns, what you'll find is a set of recommendations for energy intake. And the first one you'd want to look at is the carbohydrates. And so I've circled my percentage that I did for my fake diet that I put together. And you'll notice that it says that I have an intake of 48% of my carbohydrate. 48% of my total calories came from carbohydrates. So our goal, as you know, needs to be 58%. The way they went about getting that 47% is they took back again on this 3-day average page. You'll see under the intake column, under carbohydrates, my intake was 333 grams approximately. So what they did is they took the 333 grams times 4 calories per gram, and then they divided it by my total calories to get the percentage. So basically they took the 333 grams times 4, and this was 1,332 calories that I took in from carbohydrates, divided it by the 28 total, and we got 47%. Well, you know, our goal is 58%. So in my scenario, I'm below the 58%. So I'm going to have to raise it by about 11% in order to get it up to that 58% goal. But I'm not going to start off by raising the total carbohydrates. What I'm going to do is we're going to separate the total carbohydrates into refined sugars and complex natural sugars. So the first thing that I would want to do is determine what my simple sugar intake is, once I determine that percentage and make adjustments so that it meets the goal, then I can use that percentage to determine what my complex natural sugar needs to be to get up to that 58%. So the first thing I would need to do is look at my refined sugars. The goal is 10%. So if you're above a 10% of your calorie intake, you're going to have to reduce that down to 10% or below. If you're below 10%, say you're at 7%, you do not need to raise that to 10% unless you really want to. You're going to keep that percentage, but what that's going to force you to do is adjust your complex to above 48% so that you meet that 58% goal. For example, if you were at 7% simple sugars, then your complex is going to have to be 51%, not 48%. Now, for this paper purpose, our refined sugars are going to be anything that's a dessert, cake, pies, brownies, any of those things, and then soda, candy, and anything else that would have the simple or refined sugars in there. So in my scenario, if we look again at that 3-day average page down at the bottom of this slide, you'll see, but in your scenario, you just go down and look for carbohydrates, look for sugar, and this shows me the average grams that I ate over my 3 days. And then the carbohydrates here's your total carbohydrates, is going to include both the complex and the sugar. So what we're going to have to do is determine, from this total carbohydrates, eventually what we'll determine is how much was complex and how much was sugar. But as I mentioned, in your analysis program, your sugars include both natural sugars from fruit and things and your refined sugars. So what we're going to have to do is determine specifically what our refined sugars will be. So what that's going to force you to do is go into each day spreadsheet, which you'll find the spreadsheets at the very last pages of your 3-day average page, set of pages. And what you're going to do is go into each individual day and look at your sugar column. Now, your sugar column is going to be a couple pages away from your total carbohydrate column. So, but what I've done is I've just copy and pasted, cut and pasted, I guess, the sugar and carbs together so we can see those. But yours is going to be a little bit, they're going to be separated by some other columns. So what we need to do then is go down the sugar column here and determine what are the simple sugars in my diet. So I looked at everything and I found there was a Pepsi that I drank, and then a peach pie, which we're going to say has a sugar added to it. So on this particular day, I had 41 plus 7, about 48 grams of sugars, refined sugars, and I had a total of 284, about 285. And so if I subtracted the 285 minus the 48 for that particular day, I would have about 237 grams of complex natural sugars. But for this scenario, what you're going to need to do is go through each day and determine, first of all, what your simple sugar grams are. Then once you determine those, then you will add them up. So for example, here I had 48 on that first day that I just showed you, and then I went to the second day, I had 115. The third day I had 102 grams of refined sugars, and I added those up, divided by 3, and got an average of about 88 grams of sugars. So what I did was I took the 88 grams times 4 calories per gram, got 352 total calories of refined sugars, average, and I divided that by my total calories that I found in that first page of your 3-day average, and determined that I had about 12.4% refined sugar intake, which is above the 10% goal. So I'm going to have to reduce that down. What we're going to do then is the way I would like you to write it up, and you can see this in the student evaluation paper, is first of all you're going to show me in your write-up that what your old original intake was, which is 88 grams and 12.4%, but then determine what your goal should be. Is 70 grams. Now, the way I determine that goal, or a way you can determine that goal, is you can take your total calories, in my case it was 2828, multiply that times 10%, or 0.1, and so that gives me about 282 or 283 calories, and then divide that by 4 and calories per gram, then that gives me 70 grams. And because 28 divided by 4 is 7, so 282 would divided by 4 would give you about 70. So this is my goal, to meet 70. So I need to reduce from 88 grams down to 70 grams to meet my goal. Now, the way I did that was, and this is the format I'd like you to put it into a table where you have the days, and I apologize, this should be day 3, but you have day 1, day 2, day 3, and you have your original intakes, which I showed you, and then you're going to have your new intakes, but in between you're going to show me what you did, what adjustments you made in order to meet those goals. Okay, so what I did was I went, I looked at this and I said, well, my goal is 70 grams and this is below 70, so I'm not going to increase the sugar for that day, because the idea is you want your average to be 70. Not every individual day has to be exactly 70. You want your average to be 70. So I'm saying I'm going to leave this alone because it's below 70, and so that allows me to be a little bit higher on the other 2 days so that my average gets to be 70. What I did was then I went into the second day and I said, well, what things are high in sugars? So I looked at that second day and I said, okay, I've got I look at everything and I say, what is the highest sugar? Well, here's a high one and here was a high one. So this is my Pepsi and this is my ice cream. Okay, and I said, well, how much would I need to adjust these two things in order to get down to a reasonable amount of refined sugars? I don't have to completely get rid of my Pepsi. I don't have to completely get rid of my vanilla ice cream. I just need to reduce them down to something that would be reasonable. So what I did was I said, okay, I'm going to delete a half a cup of my ice cream. That was half of my ice cream. And I'm going, instead of 12 ounces of Pepsi, I'm just going to have 6 ounces of Pepsi. And so I reduced this by 22 grams by 20 grams. And you can see they're about half. So I reduced 41 down to 20 and 44 to about 22. So I reduced by half. And I got that average down to 73 grams for that day. And then I deleted some brownies on day 3 and got down to 85. So when I add up my new intakes and divide by 3, I get down to 69, which is really close to 70, close enough, which would represent about 10% of my intake. So I have now met my simple sugar requirements. Okay, so the next step would be to determine, okay, now that I met my 10%, what would I need to do with my complex carbohydrates and natural sugars to get my total so it reaches 58%? Because if you remember, we were at 47% earlier. So what I need to do then is go in and determine what my complex natural sugars are. If they're below 48%, then I'm going to have to raise them. If they're greater than 48%, you don't need to do anything to them unless you're over 62%. Okay, then you'd have to reduce them. But your goal is to reach that 58% goal, have at least 48% complex carbohydrates. Okay, you can't have less than 48%, but you can have more. Okay, so what I'm going to do then is I'm going to look at my total grams of carbohydrate, and the only thing that I wanted you to note for you is in this column we're looking totally at energy, and since we don't get any energy from fiber, this is not the total carbohydrates, it's the carbohydrates, energy carbohydrates, which are going to be the digestible ones where you can get calories from, and does not include the fiber grams. Okay, so your total carbohydrate would be higher because you're going to add these two together, but we're just looking at energy as far as our goals are concerned. Okay, so I look at that, and what I have determined is I made adjustments to my simple sugar intake, if you remember, down to 69 grams. Okay, and my total was 333 grams. So what I need to do is determine what adjustments do I need to make to get that up. Well, so where I'm at right now is 264 grams, which is only 37% complex natural sugars. So we need to be at 48% because our simple were 10, and then 48 plus 10 will give us 58%. So what I determined was then that to reach 48% has to be 339 grams. And there, again, what I did to get that, one way you can do it, is take your total calories, in my case 2828, times 0.48 to get your calories, and then divide by 4, and that will get you what your grams are. Okay. Or the other adjustment you could make, I suppose you could take your 69, minus this. Okay, I mean there's a mathematical way and a simple way. So 333 minus 69 would give you 264, but I'm sorry, I'm kind of off, but okay, so you would take your 228 times 0.48 and then divide by 4, and that will give you what you should be. So forget what I just said. And so 339 is where I need to be, and I'm only at 264, so I need to make some adjustments. So what I did was I just went through each day again, and I determined what was high that would be considered complex and not simple. So I said, okay, this is the highest one, this is the highest one, so that's bread and that's rice. So if I added a little bit more of those, I mean, I could have added a banana if I wanted to, but I wouldn't add peach pie. So I added another slice of bread and a cup of rice and got that up to 328 and so forth. And so I came up with a new intake. I added those new intakes together, divided by 3, came up with 339 or 48%. So now if I add 48% plus 10%, I get 58%. Okay. Now one thing I should mention and maybe I should have mentioned it before, is what you want to do when you're doing these adjustments, once you get finished, for example, with the carbohydrates here, you're going to go into the lipids, and you're going to, when you go into lipids, you're going to act like you did nothing. You're going to start from the very beginning, because I don't want you to be thinking, well, I made adjustments in carbohydrates, so I have to look at those adjustments when I'm doing my lipids, so that's going to change everything. You'd go crazy. So what you need to do is just do your carbohydrate section and get that done, And then when you go into the lipid section, you are just going to start over as if you did nothing. Because the goal of this exercise is not to get a balanced diet, because if we tried that, we'd be here forever. The goal of this exercise is just to force you to look at your food intake and the specific nutrients that are in those foods. And so you're comparing foods to nutrients, not really looking at a balanced diet. But it will also show you what adjustments you could make if you wanted to try to meet these goals and make adjustments. So our next section would be the lipids. So we're going to start this and act like we did nothing. We're going to start right from the original. And we're going to go into and look at our 3-day average page again. And we're going to look at what would be necessary to meet a goal of 30%. If you're above the 30% energy intake from lipids, you're going to have to reduce them. If you're below the 30%, you do not have to raise them. We're just going to use that number to do our adjustments, because the goal is going to be, we're going to have 3 fatty acids. We're going to have the saturated, the poly, and the mono. And each of those, what we're going to see is we need to have each of those to be 1/3 of whatever your percentage is. So if you're above 30%, then each of those types of fatty acids is going to have to be 10%. But if you're below 30%, say you're at 21%, each of them would need to be 7%. Okay, because they're going to be 1/3 of the total. All right, so that's where we're going to go then, is go to the page, that energy intake page, where we went to before for the carbs, where we had to 47%. We're going to look at our fat, and in my scenario, it's at 38%, which is above the 30%. So I'm going to have to reduce my total intake of lipids. But what I want to do first, though, I don't want to go in and just start manipulating my total fats, because the first thing I'd want to look at is my ratios of saturated, mono, and poly, and to make adjustments to those. And if I adjust those, each of those, to 10%, I will be at 30%. Okay, and so I'm going to make adjustments in these first before I do anything with the total, because if I get them correct, then my total will be correct. You'll also see a unspecified down here. Just ignore that. I've talked to the publishers, and it's just, I don't think they know what it is, but we're just concerned here. So we're going to use these, and these would then, these percentages are going to need to be 1/3 of our total percentage. So again, if you were at 21%, each of these would need to be 7%. In my scenario, I'm going to have to get this down to 30%, which means that each of these is going to have to be 10%. Well, if you look at my numbers, it makes it pretty easy, because we see mono and saturates are already 10%. So all I have to do is find out how many grams represents 10%. So I would go back into my 3-day average page with the 2 columns, and you'll notice here it shows how many grams of fat I took, but it shows the grams for each of these fats. And what I just showed you is the mono and saturated fats are at 10%. Well, what that shows you is that approximately 33 grams of this fatty acid, or any of the fatty acids, would represent 10%. So what I need to do is go through and reduce this 40-gram average down to 33, and increase the polyunsaturates up to 33, and we will be at 10% each, which would give me my 30% total. Okay. But if you're not that lucky where this equals 10%, again, one way you can determine what is 10%, take this number here, 2828, times 0.1, and then divide by 9 calories per gram. Remember, in carbohydrates we divided by 4, but in lipids we're going to divide by 9. So, and once you get that, again, 2828 times 0.1 or 10% would give you calories, for 10% intake, but divide by 9 calories per gram will give you how many grams equals 10%. So once you determine that, then each of these three would have to meet whatever that gram amount is. Okay. Now, once you determine what the grams need to be, then once again, just like the carbs, you're going to go back through down into your spreadsheets for each day, and you'll have columns for each of these for your fat, saturated, mono, and poly, and you're going to look at the totals, okay, and determine, okay, where you need to be, or what your averages are going to be for each one. So you're going to have to take each column for saturated for day 1, day 2, day 3, and you're going to have to add those up, and I mean, it gives you what your average would be, which in our scenario was about 40. So obviously I ate a lot of fat on the 2 other days because this is pretty low. So we're going to have to, but we're going to take those and do just like we do with the carbohydrates, add up the 3 days, divide by 3 to get what our average is. Well, I guess you already have it, but you're going to have to use those to determine how you're going to reduce that down to the 33. So what you would have to do, and this is not a very good column because it's pretty low, is you're going to just go through the column and try to find out, well, if you need to reduce them, then what is a high, what food is high in saturated fat, and just pick that and reduce the serving size. You don't have to totally eliminate it. I mean, you can if you want, but you just have to reduce the serving size so it gets down to a reasonable number, so that again, you'll have your table where you'll have your old intakes, your adjustments, and your new intakes. And then what you need to do is just make sure that your new intakes, when you add those up, divide by 3 and get an average, equal 33 grams, and then that'll be your 10%. And do that. And but once you get this finished and you make your adjustments, just forget that you did anything and go back to the original, because again, and I know that if you make any adjustments to this column, it will affect these, but we're not looking at a balance here. We're looking at what foods do you eat that are high in saturated that you would need to reduce. So now you know what foods you actually eat that are high in saturated, and you can be better prepared to reduce those if you need to. So once you get done with this, just start over like you did nothing. Go to the monohydrate column and or monoglyceride column, and do your reductions or whatever you need to do with that. And then once you get done with that and get it down to 10%, forget you did anything, go to the polyunsaturated and do the same thing. But what you're going to end up with then is getting and making adjustment. Again, if you look at the written evaluation, you're going to show me where you're at with saturated fat, where you need to be, and then do your table and make your adjustments and show me at the end that you did indeed meet the 10% goal. And you're going to do that for all 3 of these. Okay? The next section would be the protein, and I'm not asking you to make any adjustments to the protein intake unless you're over 20%. I mean, our goal is 12%, but unless you're over 20, we're not going to ask you to make any adjustments. The most important thing that I want you to do is determine what your animal versus plant protein intake is. If you remember from the lectures, the goal for animal protein should be 60% plant protein intake and 40% animal, you're probably going to find that you're just opposite of that. So what we need to do, unless you're over 20%, then you'd have to do the same scenario as we did with carbs and lipids and go through each day and determine what you could reduce and then show me that you met the goal. But if you're not over 20%, then basically you just need to show me what percentage you're at so that I know that you know, and then go through and determine how many proteins did I eat that were from an animal source and how many did I eat from a plant protein source, and show the differences there. And I'm not even asking you to make any adjustments. I just want you to know where you're at. So again, where you're going to find your percentage is just go to this recommendations page, and in my case I was at 17%, so I'm below 20%, so I don't need to make any overall adjustments. I just need to report that. And again, how they got that is they took 117 times 4, divided it by calories, and got the 17%. Okay, but what we need to do though is determine, and we can use this in the end, we can determine what our plant animal percentages are. So what you need to do again is go down in your spreadsheets, look at each day and look through and just determine, the first thing you need to do is, am I going to determine animal sources or plant sources? And I decided to do animal sources, so I said, okay, I just went through each food and I said, okay, yes, milk is from an animal, ham's from an animal, chicken's from an animal, and I didn't see anything else that was from an animal. So I added those up and I came up with about 49.54 grams from animal source. So if I just take 85 and subtract 49.54, I get 35.67 grams of plant. Okay, and then you do that for each day, and then the easy way would be to just determine one or the other of these and add them up for the 3 days, and then divide by 3 to get an average of animal or plant. Okay, once you get your average grams, the simple thing would be to do is just look at your total and say, well, if my average is 50 grams of animal, take 118 minus 50, and that's going to be your plant grams. Okay, then to get the percentages, you just take those grams and divide it by 118 times 100, and it'll get percent animal and percent plant. Again, the idea would be to add, just say you're going to do plant, so add up the plant protein for day 1, plant protein for day 2, plant protein for day 3, add those together, divide by 3 to get an average plant intake. If your plant intake is average 50 grams, just go to this 3-day average page, take 118 minus 50, and that will give you how many grams are animal. Okay, then take the grams of plant, say 50, divide that by 118, okay, multiply that times 100 to get a percentage, and that'll give you a percentage of plant. Okay, take 100% minus plant percent gives you animal percent, and that'll get you to where you need to be as far as how much animal and how much plant. Again, I'm not asking you to make any adjustments. I just want you to know where you're at as far as your animal and plant intake. Most students are 60 or more percent animal, for 40 or less percent plant, which is just opposite of what we need to be. So what this is going to allow you to do is, if you're very high in animal, make adjustments in your diet to add more plants to that diet, that intake, and maybe reduce some of your animal protein intake. So anyway, okay, once you get done with that, you're going to forget you did anything again and just go to the essential nutrients. There's 8 essential nutrients I'm really concerned that you look at, and if needed, make adjustments to. And so those are listed here. And the goals are going to be, if you're below 75%, intake, you need to raise those to 100%. And unless you're above the tolerable upper intake, or the UL, you don't really need to reduce them. Okay, but you need to meet 100% of all those. There are going to be some other vitamins and minerals on your sheet, some B vitamins particularly, that I have asked you to go through and give the top 3 foods for those. And by the way, I didn't mention with the lipids or proteins, but I am asking you to list the top 3 food sources of your each individual lipid, fatty acids, and the animal and plant. So I want 3 for plant, 3 for animal. Your top 3, you just go through the 3 days and just pick, the highest grams for each of those. They may all come on one day, or they may all come on separate days. It just depends on what are the top 3 food sources. And then for the B vitamins, that. But for the B vitamins, you don't have to make adjustments and do anything. You just list what are the top 3. So where we're going to find those is in that 3-day average page with the 2 columns. Here's your DRI, and here's your intake. And over here is going to be your percentages. And anything that's below 75%, you're going to need to make adjustments. So I just highlighted or pointed that these are ones that are below 70% that I'm going to have to make adjustments to. So once again, what you would do is go to your spreadsheets for each day and look at your vitamin C intake and make adjustments, just like we did with the carbs and so forth, food intakes, and make your tables and everything to show me what adjustments you need to make to get this up to the 100%. And the 100% is going to be your DRI. So for vitamin C, 100% would be 90 milligrams in my case. For vitamin D, it'd be 10 micrograms. For vitamin E, it'd be 15 milligrams is my goal. So I'm going to have to reduce again from 46 up to 90 average. Again, it doesn't have to be each day. The average needs to be 90 milligrams. So you just go through and you make adjustments in your food intake to meet that 90 milligram intake goal. Okay, but you can see everything else has met the goal, so I don't need to make any adjustments with those. But again, for each of these, you need the top 3 food sources for each of those. Okay. And I'm going to ask you for vitamin A is retinol equivalents. And what that means is, if you eat meat and stuff, you're getting retinol, vitamin A. But if you eat like carrots, which have beta carotene that can be converted into vitamin A retinol, then there's retinol equivalents. So I'm going to ask you to use the retinol equivalents for that because it gives you a percentage. As far as sodium, anything that's over 100%, even if you're 101%, because of its relationship to hypertension, I want you to reduce it to 100%. So you must be below 100%. So again, you look at your sodium. Mine's at 289. My goal is 1300, so I have to reduce from an average of about 3800 down to 1300. So I'm going to have to go through and look at foods that are high in sodium. You go through each day of your spreadsheets, look at the sodium column, and make adjustments to reduce those. Okay. As far as fiber, you're going to look at your fiber, and you're going to use the 75% rule. And here's your fiber gram amount, and here's your percentage, so you can see I met the goal of 75%. I'm at 89%. But if you remember from the lectures, the goals for carbohydrates for fiber is you want 75% intake of insoluble, 25% soluble. So even though this gram amount met the goal, I may not have met the ratio that I need to do. So I need to determine what my ratio is of insoluble to soluble and make adjustments to make sure I meet that 3-to-1 ratio or 75% 25% ratio. So 30 grams is going to be my goal when I'm doing the fiber intake. So I would like you to use the DRI goal to do your ratios, because that's really where I should be. So what I did was, again, your ratio insoluble soluble should be 3-to-1 or 75% 25%. So if we look at our DRI of 30 grams, if I take 30 times 75, I should be getting 22.5 grams of insoluble and 70.5 of soluble. And so we're going to use these numbers to determine that. Okay. For this exercise or for this paper, we're going to be looking at fruits, oats, anything that's oatmeal. Legumes would be like black beans, navy beans, chili beans, those kinds of things would be legumes. All are going to be considered soluble. And water insoluble vegetables or anything that's wheat, 100% whole wheat bread. Grains would be like rice or rye or something like that, would be under insoluble. So we're going to consider these foods all soluble. Now you know and I know that they're mixed, but we're going to consider these all soluble because they're highest in soluble, these high in insoluble. So the way I'm going to have to determine, again, is where I'm at as far as soluble and insoluble is to go through the spreadsheets. So I'm going to have to go down these foods, and again, looking at this information and this information, we are going to go through the foods and determine which ones are soluble, which ones are insoluble. So I kind of previewed this and I said, well, I know it's going to be mostly insoluble, so let me just do the soluble, and because there's going to be less of them, and then I'll just do a subtraction. So I said, okay, Cheerios is soluble, bananas are fruit, so they're soluble, and then peaches are soluble because the crust here is going to be white, probably white flour, so there's nothing there. So we're going to consider those the peaches. So I add those up and get 10 grams of soluble and 20, with a total of 25 grams of fiber. That leaves me with about 16 grams of insoluble. Well, our goal was 22 and 7.5. For that day, I didn't meet it. But again, we're looking at the average. So what you're going to have to do is go through and look at each individual day, add those days up, and divide by 3 to get your average soluble. Once again, kind of like the animal and plant protein, if you wanted to, you could just look at the soluble, add those up, get an average, and then subtract 30 minus that average would give you what your insoluble is, average, and then you would know where your adjustments need to be, because we need to meet the 22.5, 7.5 goals for that. And you probably shouldn't be surprised if you have to increase your insoluble and decrease your soluble. That's pretty normal. So again, do the same things. You'd go through each day and just find out if you need to reduce soluble, find out what foods are high and reduce them so you meet that 7.5 gram average, and then go through and increase insoluble foods and show me again the table that we had in the carbohydrates so that you can show me where your adjustments are and that you met the goal. And your summary is just kind of humoring me, saying how much you enjoyed this whole project, which it's a lot of work. This project is a lot of work, but I think you're going to learn a lot from it. And so I wouldn't wait till the last minute to do this project. I would do a little bit every so often, and you can send me a rough draft of, like, if you did the carbohydrate section, I would allow you to send me a rough draft of that, and I can tell you if you're on the right track as far as your format, as far as how you're figuring your information. So feel free to do that. Just attach it to an email, and I'll look at it and I'll give you a response back. But it's basically a summary of what did you learn. And then what would you think you should do if you wanted to meet your goals and make adjustments in your diet? But other than that, I usually don't take any points off, or I've never taken any points off for the introduction or the summary. It's just basically, what did you learn, from this information? And I think you'll learn a lot. But enjoy it as much as you can, and just know that you're learning about yourself and what adjustments you can make. Okay. If there are any other questions, don't hesitate to write me an email, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. All right.